So, thank you for those of you who are here, and those of you who are not here. Be here on time, and look at those who are trying to watch the video later on. Please arrive on time. What we are going to do is to continue our analysis of regime types in the Middle East, and then hopefully we'll finish this and move to discussing the history of the rise of Islam, the religion that defines the Middle East to a large extent, and still has considerable influence on political and economic institutions of Middle Eastern countries. So we talked about Turkey as an example of a moderate socialist republic. And we talked about the emergence of modern Turkey, how it evolved into its current political system. Continuing that analysis, another important Middle Eastern country is Egypt. And in certain period in history of Egypt, it also was governed as a moderate socialist republic, or one could argue that even a more radical type of socialist republic. Here we are focusing on primarily economic institutions. So for most of its history, Egypt was a kingdom, at some periods an independent kingdom. In more recent periods, in 19th century and first half of 20th century, it was under the dominance of the British Empire, but the British Empire decided to maintain the kingdom. And the last king was King Farouk. But in 1952, a number of military officers under the leadership of Jamal Abdul Nasser, that you see the picture here, orchestrated a military coup d'etat, meaning that they were members of the army. They orchestrated a military takeover of the government and removed Farouk as the king that was in power. So they toppled the monarchy, and they also took a number of steps which consolidated economic power in the hand of the military leadership, because under the monarchy there were a number of political parties. There were Islamic groups, there were secular groups that were functioning with different types of demands. And of course we are talking about the period of Cold War, after World War II. So we need to put, whenever we discuss domestic political conditions or domestic economic conditions in these countries, we need to put it in the proper international context. What was the international climate in 1950s? It was the peak of Cold War between Soviet Union on one hand, which represented the communist bloc, and the United States on the other side, representing the capitalist bloc. In the Middle East, in 1948, the country of Israel had been established, and Arab countries were in conflict with Israel, trying to liberate the Palestinians, because they believed that the entire region belonged to the Palestinians. So the number of wars were already waged immediately after Israel was declared. And Egypt saw itself as at the forefront of a struggle for liberation of Palestine, the war against Israel. So this is all the context that we need to know about. So Jamal Abdel Nasser took power. He was a very charismatic leader, and his charisma went beyond Egypt. He soon emerged as a leader of Arab nationalism and Arab unity. So for example, he called for unifying the Arab world, creating unity among various countries. He even, for a while, created a political unity with Syria, which of course did not work. So in 1953, he abolished the political parties. Another group that was abolished under his rule was the Muslim Brotherhood. So you have two kinds of political activists or groups in the Middle East. The secular groups, which were primarily leftist, meaning that they mostly identified with Soviet Union, anti-imperialism, and because the Western Bloc was supporting Israel, they had that orientation towards the Soviet Union. And then you have the Muslim Brotherhood. These are the groups that believed primarily the solution for strengthening the Arab world was through Islamic unity and through return to Islamic values and Islamic core belief. One of them was the Muslim Brotherhood. Another important step that Nasser took when he came to power in Egypt was to nationalize the Suez Canal. What does that mean? Suez Canal, we have seen the map of the Middle East, is a very important waterway that was constructed by the British that connects the Red Sea to the Mediterranean. So it reduces the distance for shipping lanes that want to go to Europe. Before that canal, they had to go around Africa, and I'll show you that on the map. But once the canal was constructed, it was much easier to go to trade between Asia and Europe because you could go through from Indian Ocean through the Suez Canal to Mediterranean. So he nationalized that, meaning that it was under British control, but Jamal Abdel Nasser nationalized it, which of course provoked a military response by the British, French, and Israelis. They combined forces, but later on, because of US intervention, Egypt succeeded in maintaining control over Suez Canal. So after abolishing all political activities, he created a single party called the Liberation Rally. He advocated for Arab nationalism, and his policies were similar to Ataturk, meaning that he advocated and he had enough power as this charismatic leader to defend the right of the state to have a leadership and very, very dominating role in the economy. During the rule of the monarchy, there were very large landlords, there were very large foreign holdings, meaning holdings that belonged to Great Britain, belonged to other European powers, and he nationalized many of them. At the same time, there was a significant amount of poverty and inequality, so his drive to nationalize foreign assets was very popular. It was considered a populist move. And that was one of the aspects of statism. What is statism? We mentioned it in our previous class. The fact that government has the state or government has a dominant role in the economy, has the right to command and design economic planning for the economy and mobilize the resources of the economy. Another important aspect of his economic policies was a major land reform. What is land reform in economic policy? What does it mean when we say land reform? Yes?
To change who owns what and redistribute
Correct. Anyone else likes to? It probably, it means land ownership reform. Generally in these societies, they are feudal societies. You have large owners, landlords, and the farmers do not own the land. They simply have the right to live in the small villages, cultivate the land, and the crop is distributed between the farmer and the landlord. There is what is called sharecropping or crop sharing, which means that whatever the amount of crop we yield from the land, when it comes to harvest season, certain portion is taken by the landlord, and the rest of it is kept by the farmer for sustenance and also seed for next year's farming summer. So land reform meant that he confiscated the lands that belonged to large landlords, and many of them were foreigners, distributed some of it as small pieces to farmers so that they became landowner farmers, and kept some of it still as state-owned farming land. And in Egypt, most of the land is dry. The fertile land is the land around the river Nile. If you look at the map of Egypt, most of it is yellow, meaning desert. But from the Google map, if you look at it, that narrow strip around the Nile River, which enters from the south and goes all the way north into the Mediterranean, is a fertile land. Especially it becomes a large fertile land in northern part of Egypt as it approaches Mediterranean. So that was an important step, both in terms of economic redistribution for a primarily agricultural society and in terms of impact on agriculture. Because giving the land to farmers could have, if there is enough support, could increase productivity. But if there isn't enough government support, it might have an adverse effect on production. But you can see the structure of the policy. All private lands larger than 1.08 acres were expropriated. A total of 425,000 acres of land was seized from large landowners. And as I said, some of it was redistributed to small landowners and landless farmers, and the rest of it was kept by the government as government-owned land. So, along with that, because most of the industry, manufacturing, was also foreign-owned, Nasser also nationalized commercial and industrial units. So you can see why this represents sort of Soviet-style management. Of course, in Soviet Union, all property was confiscated, but in Egypt, similar to Turkey, some property was nationalized, but the small businesses were allowed to function. There were merchants, and none of the small property was seized. In doing so, Jamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the British and French assets, including Suez Canal, which provoked a military reaction by three countries. So already Israel was in the state of war. It was a war of attrition with Egypt that began immediately after Israel was created. There was an initial war against Israel that was defeated, but after that, a low attrition conflict continuously continued. And Israel had a stake in opposing the nationalization of Suez Canal, because as long as it was under British control, Israeli vessels could also go through the Suez Canal in order to access Israel. But once it was nationalized, Israel also lost access to Suez Canal. Therefore, Israel joined France and United Kingdom to prevent it. This behavior of Britain and France, Great Britain and France, was part of their legacy of colonialism. They were both large empires, and even after World War II, despite the fact that the United States was pressuring them to abandon their colonial policies, they still wanted to maintain as much control as possible around the world. In the 1950s, Great Britain, for example, was continuously fighting with independence movements in Africa. And it was only after bloody wars that it conceded to the independence of India in 1948. India was also a British colony. So they still thought that they can independently exert influence and act like empires, as important powers. But the United States had already established itself as the sole surviving superpower after World War II. The Soviets were emerging, but it was the United States that had the real power. So the United States got angry with them. I think it was President Dwight Eisenhower who said to the British, "How dare you declare war without our permission?" So if it wasn't for US intervention, the French, the British, and Israelis were able to defeat Jamal Abdel Nasser and seize the Suez Canal again. They actually had an initial victory when it was defeated. But under US pressure, they all knew that they are no match for the United States. Therefore, once the US wanted them to get out, just like the movie Get Out, that some of you might have seen, they respectfully got up. And they acknowledged that the United States is the new power in the world. So that was an important event. Okay, so one of the common functions or behaviors of statist governments, these governments that are established by a charismatic power which has monopoly over political system, is that they try to suppress independent political parties, but they mobilize people into political activities that are organized and supported by government, and they are under government supervision. So commonly what they do is to create syndicates based on profession. They allow and promote engineers syndicates or labor unions that are not independent but are managed by appointed organizers or appointed managers that are affiliated with the ruling regime. And that's what you see here. Citizens were not allowed to be in independent political parties, but they were encouraged and there were opportunities to join occupational syndicates, government-controlled syndicates, for example, for physicians, syndicates for teachers, for engineers, and labor unions, those kind of organizations. That's why we say it was organizing according to function and occupation. So they are allowed within limits to lobby for their group interest. for example, as shop owners or as engineers or positions. But this kind of organization means that when government wants to organize a rally, a mass rally, they can call on the leaders of these organizations and say, tomorrow we want 200,000 people marching in the street in support of the leader. So they would bring large numbers of people for government-organized demonstrations and protests. That is the common function in which the organizations that are managed from the top behave in these countries. Again, that is another way that the government in Egypt was similar to the government that Ataturk created in Turkey, and one could say that was influenced by it, because as we saw last time, Mustafa Kemal, known as Ataturk, created the government of Turkey in 1920s and 1930s. And that became a role model for many leaders after World War II, including Jamal Abdel Nasser in 1950s and 1960s. That's why we see policies and vision of Nasser were similar to Turkey under Ataturk in many aspects. And Jamal Abdel Nasser continued this, his success in maintaining control over Suez Canal was considered a major victory for him, which gave him more prominence and more popularity and recognition in the Arab world. And he continued his campaign to mobilize for another war with Israel. Since Egypt was considered the leader of the Arab world in terms of cultural center and political leadership. So here is the map that gives you an idea of the region that you're talking about. This part was part of Egypt during 1956. This is the Suez Canal that we mentioned. You see the Red Sea. This side is Saudi Arabia. You come up here. No, this is Saudi Arabia is right here. This is Israel and Egypt. And here the Suez Canal. The battle was fought, and Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. So, he felt confident enough to prepare for war, for another war. But in June 1967, Israelis anticipating that Nasser was about to attack Egypt, initiated a preemptive strike against Egypt. A war broke out, which was very short. I think it was only 7 days. Jordan joined Egypt, Syria joined Egypt. And soon it became a very major conflict, even though it was short. Obviously, there was foreign support on either side. The Soviets were supporting Egypt. The British and French back then were the supporters of Israel. The war broke out, but very quickly the Israelis were able to win the war, and they even came forward, and Jamal Abdel Nasser was defeated, and even the Sinai Peninsula came under Israeli control, so that Israelis came even close to the Suez Canal, which of course they retreated a portion of it, but maintained control over the Sinai after 1967. So that was a major defeat for Nasser. Yes?
Why did the Soviet Union choose to support Egypt?
Because Egypt, they supported any leader that was willing to ally with them. And because of his struggle against Israel, Nasser chose to be siding with the Soviets. The British he actually had orchestrated the coup against the monarchy and the British. So it was for that reason. He actually had good relations with the United States for a while. And even in 1967, as this push continued for further gain by Israel, it was the United States that sort of held them back, didn't allow it to go too far. But that was a major defeat. By then, he was popular enough in the Arab world that there was a word called Nasserism, meaning the ideology of Nasser that was spreading all over the Arab world, which was a combination of Arab nationalism, especially focused on unity to liberate Palestine. Of course, Palestine means the greater area of Israel, in which two areas were identified as predominantly Arab, but the Israelis had, through a course of events, already established the country in this area that shows by the yellow color, with the support of the Western powers. They had received UN recognition for the country that they had established. Nevertheless, I think all of you know that this struggle has continued until today, and still we see the impact of the conflict on the entire region. So what happened? After this defeat, which was really a very significant blow, Nasser sort of acknowledged the defeat and said that it is my duty to resign. But as a popular leader, he enjoyed support. So his supporters were organized and they came into the streets in Cairo, the capital, and he was preserved in power. But that defeat sort of affected his spirit, and he suffered a heart attack in 1970. And he was replaced by one of his military officers, Anwar Sadat. So he himself was very much committed to war, even though he was defeated in 1967. War of attrition between Israel and Egypt continued on the frontier of their ceasefire zone. But Anwar Sadat had a different vision because he realized that Soviet Union is not strong enough to support him. He thought the only way he could really increase Egypt's influence and perhaps achieve support for some kind of bargaining power against Israel was to switch allegiance, meaning to leave the Soviet camp and come to the Western side. And that's what he did. He also later on changed his position, but not before making another attempt. After the June 1967 war, and one of the consequences of this June 1967 war was that before that war, Israel was defined by these borders here, just the yellow region. But after 1967 war, Israel captured the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. It even came into Sinai, but it was retreated back to that area. So already that war resulted in another defeat for the Arab world. And that's the beginning of the occupation of the Palestinian territories. Before that, the Palestinians were fighting against Israel because Israel itself has an Arab population. Even now, 20% of Israel's population is Arab. But after that war, large areas of the Palestinian population, meaning the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, came under Israeli control. So their pressure was mounting on Saddam, the next leader of Egypt, to also take action. So he waged another war against Israel in 1973. In this war, there was an initial success by Egypt. But immediately afterwards, Israel changed the balance of power, and Israelis started gaining. The Soviet Union intervened and threatened to stop Israelis if they keep advancing towards Egypt, and the United States realized that it might result in nuclear confrontation. Therefore, the United States stepped forward and sort of stopped Israel from advancing too much, and it allowed Anwar Sadat again to sort of find a face-saving measure and end that conflict as well. So by that time, it was by that time that Sadat realized this policy of siding with Soviet Union to fight against Israel is not going to be successful. And by that time, we also realized that these domestic policies of Anwar Sadat, the economic policies, were producing all kinds of economic problems. Jamal Abdel Nasser had used the import substitution policy that we talked about earlier. There were domestic industries. He had ran large government deficits to finance industrialization. But by 1970s, government was running very large deficits. There were financial troubles for the country because of heavy external debt. So Sadat realized that there is a need to initiate economic reform as well. So after this 1973 war, he changed his position. He improved the relations with the United States, and he initiated a rapprochement with Israel, which was, of course, very unpopular with the Arab world because nobody in the Arab world wanted to have a normalization with Israel. But nevertheless, he took the initiative. It was a period where the United States had finally left Vietnam, and there was a deep popularity for peace initiatives. The US president was a democratic, very liberal president who took the steps of trying to mediate peace between Israel and Egypt. And you can see the signing ceremony where I think they met in Washington, if I'm not mistaken, in 1978 in Camp David, a location in Washington, D.C., to sign a peace agreement between Egypt and Israel. But of course, there was a very strong economic dimension to this step that Anwar Sadat took. The economic dimension was that, first of all, when this reached, he received considerable aid, both military aid and economic aid from the United States, by also agreeing to initiate economic reforms, sort of ending that large state domination of the economy, promoting privatization, trying to attract foreign capital. He also received support from the International Monetary Fund. we said that IMF, when countries are in trouble, they go to IMF. And by promising to initiate economic reforms, they can also receive funds from IMF in order to support their economy. So he introduced economic liberalization and deregulation of the economy, sort of trying to attract foreign capital, trying to promote investment in the country. Of course, in order to make these policies successful, you need to also have good governance. Remember, we showed you the indicators of good governance: rule of law, good regulations, and above all, preventing corruption. But what happened in Egypt after these reforms was that they were partially successful because corporations and wealthy individuals that were connected to the ruling regime had an advantage, a political advantage, so the process was corrupt, and when you initiate capitalism reforms, move towards capitalism, but there is corruption, it is called crony capitalism, which is what emerged in Egypt and what has emerged in many Middle Eastern countries when they try to introduce economic reforms according to Western recommendations, by liberalizing your economy, opening up your market. You need good governance to make that successful. Of course, because of this initiative, which many people in Egypt also did not like, making peace with Israel, he was assassinated. He was assassinated in a ceremony where the troops, the Egyptian troops, were marching, and he was standing to salute them. So one of the officers walked towards him, and he thought that the officer wants to salute him, but he actually pulled out his rifle and started shooting at him. So he was assassinated. And of course he was replaced by another military officer, Hosni Mubarak, this man, who ruled Egypt and continued these policies of economic reform and also maintaining good relations with the United States, preserving the peace until the Arab Spring. So for, one could say, for 30 years, Hosni Mubarak was in power in Egypt. So country had political stability. That's a period, especially when this issue of crony capitalism became very significant. Because, for example, he had two sons, and his sons were practically managing the awarding of the contracts. So anybody who wanted to do business in Egypt had to go see one of Hosni Mubarak's sons, pay a kickback, pay some kind of bribe. So the people of Egypt very much resented the situation. In the meantime, throughout these periods, the Muslim Brotherhood, which was banned, was active as a social organization. It was providing all kinds of services in poor neighborhoods, because under these economic liberalization policies, the government was trying to cut back its own expenditure for social support programs. Why? Because they wanted to make sure the amount of government deficit is not too large, so they didn't have enough to spend on anti-poverty programs, healthcare programs. Muslim Brotherhood, as a volunteer organization, offered all kinds of services. So they became popular. They were not allowed to function as a political party, but they became popular in the society. And the influence of Islam in society kept growing. People became more religious, more affiliated with Islamic values, while the leadership remained secular. So you had this cultural division in the society. Questions, comments? Okay, well, very briefly, after Arab Spring, he was arrested. The country had an elected president who actually was from the Muslim Brotherhood, Mohammad Morsi. For 2 years, the country had a very liberal environment, but the economic elite and the military did not like the situation. There were some sabotage in government service provisions that were partly orchestrated. The country faced many kind of economic instabilities, and finally, after 2 years, another military ruler, military general, General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, orchestrated another military takeover, and he is now the current leader of Egypt. He has created a stable government, but he has shown a commitment to anti-corruption. He himself is, of course, a very religious person. So if you visit Egypt, I was there last year, we have here Mr. Alan Feldman, who had a one semester abroad, even a year. Everywhere you go, you see construction activity, and everywhere you go, you see big pictures of Mr. Sisi all over the country as the current leader. That is the current status of the country. There's been the continuation of these new liberal economic policies in Egypt. Questions, comments? Let's take our 5-minute break, and we'll switch to historical stories of the Middle East. So I'm going to distribute the write-up for your project number 2 and talk about it a little bit. If you can distribute this way. Send it to the back, and then at the end, if there is any left, just give it to us. Okay. Okay, we need to start, since you are already submitted your report number 1, we don't want to waste any time, we go directly to preparation for report number 2. And let's take a moment to read it, please. We start reading it if you don't mind, to see what is expected. I want to make sure you at least read it. Thank you. Very good. So you can see that it's still not very long, because I'm sure in many of your classes if you are a junior or a senior, you're expected to write 2,500, 3,000 words. So this is maybe 4 to 6 pages max, depending on how you write. Did everyone get one? Make sure you have one of these explanation for the report number 2. You don't have it? Okay. It's also available online, but make sure you have it. Very good. All right, so this one, you have 2 options. You can focus on a single economy. You choose a country based on the country that you like, or focus on investigating an economic issue across 2 or 3 countries, sort of a comparative analysis paper. It depends on your taste. Some people like to just investigate one economic topic in one country. Some people like to compare. And then I have a number of examples for you. Please read those examples to see if you like any of them. You don't have to go through all of them. For example, the first one says, a report about an industry or an economic activity that you are personally passionate about. Because I think if you are curious about, let's say, automotive industry or the telecommunication industry, or perhaps something that's related to another course that you are taking, you would enjoy writing the paper more. You learn about the economy of a Middle Eastern country, but you also increase your own knowledge and understanding of that specific industry. I have had students in the past focus on art. For example, the development of art industry in the United Arab Emirates. I have had students writing about the competitive sports in the Middle East, FIFA, soccer games, things like that. So you can choose any of those topics. Or I have one interesting comparative example for you, the number 4. Comparing the economic conditions of the Kurdish regions in one or two of the 4 MENA countries with large Kurdish population. So for example, one of the largest ethnic minorities in the world and in the Middle East are the Kurds, which live in Iraq, in Syria, in Iran, and Turkey. Occasionally they have fought for independence, they have certain rights, and sometimes they have tension with the central government. So you can focus on learning about their economic conditions and writing about it if you are interested. And you can look at the rest of them for yourself. Now, again, I emphasize, you need to have citations, meaning that you need to have read at least 5 articles in your analysis, and you need to list 5 references, which means what? Which means that those 5 references, each one of them must be cited at least once. What does citation mean? It means that you bring in a quote from them, or if you have learned something from a specific article, at the end of a paragraph or at the end of a sentence, you mention the name of the author and the year. That's called citation. Often you see it at the end of a sentence listed. And then when I look at the list of references, that author's name appears at the beginning of that specific reference. I'm sure you are familiar with it, but because some of you forget, I'd like to emphasize that to make sure you don't forget. I do encourage you, depending on the topic that you choose, to bring in tables, charts, graphs. That's why we practiced in project number 1. And bring in your own paper or your own charts, get the data and create your own charts for this purpose. Any questions? Yes?
Can the source be like a data source, like statistical data?
No. Data source, obviously, you need to mention if you use data. But that means a reading source, you see. An article that you have read about the country. That's what I would like to do. If you know nowadays with all of these search engines, it's very easy to find citation sources on any topic. It's unavoidable. Some of you might use ChatGPT or any other AI software. Use it for research. Don't say write a 1,500 word article on this topic for you. If you say that in about 10 seconds it generates an article like that, in it has that capability. I'll do my best to identify that. But you can say, tell me about this topic, read that. It can even generate citations, sources, recommend sources for you. Read it and then write with your own words. Okay. Using it as a tool for learning, because it speeds up the process. There's nothing wrong with that. You're just learning. It's an available tool. And for the rest of your lives, it will always be available to you. Yes.
Is it okay if I use GPT to generate a reference list?
You can ask for them, but you need to check them one by one because of something called hallucination. We are improving, but still they generate fake references.
I mean, I give it a website. It just helps me to write the right format. Like API.
Oh yes, like say, generate the reference in Chicago format. It does it for you. Yes, it's that's. I don't think that's plagiarism. All you need to learn that, but hey, there was a time when you had to do multiplication by hand, but now you can't ask people to do it by hand when you have calculators. So the important thing is to understand references, but you're right to tell it what to generate, it will generate it, but it's your own reference. You just tell it, I want it in this form. Okay. Make sure your report has a structure. Look at the top of page 2. Use headings, subheadings, argue. Make sure at the beginning you say, here is the topic, here is the key finding that I'm going to support. This is what I have realized about the topic. And then provide evidence and make sure you have the conclusion section so that the report has a structure. Very good. But our first step is to choose our topics, and that is due February 10th. Please think about it over the weekend. Let's go here. Okay, let's go to our website. I have already created a folder for you that you can submit your topic. This is not the article, just the topic. With here it is. Submit the title of your project. So it's due February 10th, which means that on February 10th, when you come to class, I'm going to give you, near the end of the class, one of these empty sheets, and I say you have time to think about your topic. Please write the topic of your paper, and write maybe 100 words about it. So please go ahead and use the time between now and February 10th to think about the topic that you like to select. Okay? And that is important because I'm going to keep that and read it, and how you explain your topic would affect your grade. Up to now we were just writing for fun and learning, but this is part of the project. Remember I said I want you to do some writing here. So get ready, because after a couple of weeks, one day I'm going to say, write your introduction, maybe half an hour, maybe 2 paragraphs of your introduction in class, but I give you a warning ahead of time so you can start thinking about it. All right. And then you transfer that to your main report. Questions? We're going to learn more about this. I just wanted to give you an example of these two. We have other types of governments. We'll come back to them. But let's go start our historical analysis in this. So this PowerPoint is also available if you like to start looking. Okay, now we're going to go back. So we know what Middle East looks like now. All of those countries, some of them small, some of them large. Like any other region of the world, the political map of Middle East has changed many times. But one of the most important events that has shaped the region was the emergence of Islam. And if you look at the region, it has a small Jewish population, a small Christian population, but it's predominantly a Muslim region, meaning the region in which majority of people practice one type or other of branches of Islam. So the story begins in 7th century, the story of Islam. And it begins in modern day Saudi Arabia, right about here, near Mecca. There were various tribes living in here and all parts of here, but the Middle East region was dominated by two empires back then. The Persian Sassanid Empire and the East Roman Byzantine Empire. So they were continuously at war. The border between them would go back and forth, and for them, these regions with the small tribes were marginal. And because this area, which is now modern-day Saudi Arabia or these very rich oil-exporting countries, was just desert without any significant resources, nobody was interested in this region. Because back then, crude oil was not an essential source of energy. The world was not industrial, therefore there was no demand. And because there weren't much of resources, there was much interest in these tribes. Occasionally there would be intrusions, but they were considered very much marginal in terms of global distribution of power. But in the 7th century, actually in the early 7th century, the religion of Islam emerged, and from the beginning it emerged not just as a religion but also as a state, meaning that the leader of that religion, Muhammad, and his followers not only created a religion, but they, based on that religion, they created a state that emerged here, originally from this modern city of currently called Medina, but it expanded very rapidly in a short span of time. It defeated those large empires, conquered all of those territories, and spread the reach of Islamic rule into Asia, coming all the way into India, just in that initial 100 years, and then moving westward towards northern Africa and Spain. Spain, for several centuries, was under Islamic rule. Over time after that, through trade, through cultural influence, it is spread to Africa. We have a large Muslim population in many African countries. And in Asia, you have large Muslim populations in India. You have Indonesia, which is the largest Muslim population altogether. Pakistan, a country now of about 150 million, maybe even more. So it spread very rapidly. But the key influence was in the Middle East region. And we want to know how it emerged and what are some key teachings of Islam that are still influential in shaping social, cultural, and economic behaviors of the Muslim countries. Okay, we have a number of videos.
Becomes a contentious issue that we'll talk about in other videos. Is the seed, as we talked about, was born roughly in 570 and dies in 632. And on this timeline here, the white period is before, according to Muslim traditions, that he started having the revelations from God. And the brown period is when he's having these revelations and he's starting to be the leader of this nascent Muslim.
Oh, he's talking about the rise of Prophet Muhammad. Let's go to the very beginning, because
in other videos we have talked about the early history of Islam, which really revolves around the life of Muhammad. And Muhammad, as we talked about, was born roughly in 570 and dies in 632. And on this timeline here, the white period is before, according to Muslim traditions, that he started having the revelations from God. And the brown period is when he's having these revelations and he's starting to be the leader of this nascent Muslim community. Now what we see here in this dark brown is what was in control of this Muslim community at the time of Muhammad's death. And you see, even by that period, they had control of a good chunk of the Arabian Peninsula. And what's particularly surprising is how fast Islam spread shortly after that. The next period, after Muhammad dies, the leadership of the community, of the Ummah, goes to the caliphs. And this actually becomes a contentious issue that we'll talk about in other videos. It's the seed of the eventual schism between the Sunnis and the Shias. But this next period, the Rashidun, or the rightly guided caliphs, caliph means successors, essentially successors to Muhammad. Under these four caliphs, you see Islam spread from as far west as Tunisia and Egypt, all the way through Persia. And keep in mind, this is spreading, overtaking, conquering what used to be controlled by very powerful empires. The Byzantine Empire, or Eastern Roman Empire, taking territory from them here, and then Sassanid Persia, taking territory from them, and this is less than 30 years. And then it spreads even more. During the next caliphate, which is now dynastic, the Umayyad Caliphate, by the end of that, at 750 CE, you see Islam has now spread or conquered from modern-day Spain and Portugal all the way to modern-day India and Pakistan.
So partly this conquest was driven by this feeling of religious duty to spread Islam all over the world. So it was perceived as a religious duty for whoever ruled to continuously focus on trying to convert people into Islam, either by force or voluntarily. And also it was considered a duty for Muslims to participate in these military initiatives. Again, because there was this belief that this is part of our duty in order to achieve salvation and go to heaven. At the same time, because of the fact that there was a strong connection to Judaism and Christianity, when Muslims conquered these lands, those who were of Jewish faith or Christianity were allowed to keep their religion. They were not forced to convert, but they were expected to pay a certain tax in return for which they did not have to participate in military. So they would be subjects under protection and under safety, but without participation as full citizens, because they were considered different.
And we could continue this narrative, and we will continue to talk about it in future videos. But what's really interesting is to think about how and why it was able to spread this rapidly. There's very few instances in history where we see this type of an empire form this quickly. And to get some context on that, we have this text here from the American historian Ira Lapidus' book, Islamic Societies to the 19th Century. And Ira Lapidus writes, the expansion of Islam involved different factors in different regions. In North Africa, Anatolia, the Balkans, and India. So these are regions that we aren't showing in this map. Those happened later on, outside of the period depicted in this map. It was carried out by nomadic Arab or Turkish conquerors. And so that is a similar form method that we're talking about, though, in this map. In the Indian Ocean and West Africa, it spread by peaceful contacts among merchants or through the preaching of missionaries. In some cases, the diffusion of Islam depended on its adoption by local ruling families. In others, it appealed to urban classes of the population or tribal communities. The question of why people convert to Islam has always generated intense feeling. Earlier generations of European scholars believed that conversion to Islam were made by the point of the sword, and that conquered peoples were given the choice of conversion or death. So according to Ira Lapidus, these early European scholars viewed it analogous to things like the Spanish Inquisition, or some aspects of the Crusades, or some of what we saw in the New World with the conquistadors, where it really was convert or die. But according to Lapidus, it is now apparent that conversion by force, while not unknown in Muslim communities, so in Muslim countries, so there was some forced conversion, but according to Lapidus was in fact rare. Muslim conquerors ordinarily wished to dominate rather than convert, and most conversions to Islam were voluntary. In most cases, worldly and spiritual motives for conversion blended together. And others.
So, again, the context is important. In case of Persia, for example, the rise of Islam happened at a time when there was significant inequality and perception of injustice within society. So that when the Muslim conquerors came, some people resisted, but many people who were living in poverty and facing injustice in a very hierarchical society actually experienced it as liberation. So the statement is true. Some people were forced, but there were also many cases where the conversion was because the message was of equality, and they realized that there would be opportunities and a new social system in which there could be less suffering and less hierarchical injustice in the society.
Sources I've looked at do hint that these early caliphates weren't that interested in conversion. They were clearly Muslim, and they were also Arab-dominated. And they liked having this elite Arab Muslim ruling class, and they weren't that interested in spreading the religion. And only when we get into the Abbasid Caliphate, where it becomes more multicultural and more Muslim and less Arab-focused, that you start to have more and more conversions. And the sources I've seen have, by the end of the Umayyad dynasty, only about 10 to 30% of the conquered people convert to Islam, but much more convert during what's often referred to as the Golden Age of Islam, when Islam is collecting the works of the ancient Greeks and the Chinese and the Hindus and getting scholars from all around the world under the Abbasid dynasty. Now, when Lapidus talks about, in most cases, worldly and spiritual motives for conversion blended together, he's referring to these ideas that, well, maybe for some people it just appealed to them. And you have to remember, people weren't going from being independent to being subjugated in most cases. Even before the conquest of Islam, they were probably subjugated by a king or part of an empire like the Byzantine Empire or the Persian Empire. And so they're really switching from one conqueror to another. And oftentimes people are hopeful that the new conqueror might be better than the last. So oftentimes they're proven wrong, sometimes it might actually be the case. And so there might have been some support that allowed it to spread this quickly. And there's also worldly motives. If there's a Muslim ruling class, and if you want to be associated with that ruling class, that might be a worldly motivation in order to actually convert. Now, the other thing that we do know about these early Muslim empires, and many of the Muslim empires, is they did have this notion of dhimmi status. And dhimmi is referring to the idea of protected persons. And it's often referred to as people of the book. But it included Jews, Christians, that Islam, according to Islamic tradition, follows in the same tradition of. But then, when you eventually have Muslim conquest of India, included Hindus and Buddhists as well. And it also included Zoroastrians, who the early Muslims considered to be monotheistic. And the idea of dhimmi status is that they would have protected rights, they would have the same property, contract rights, but different political rights. The Muslim ruling class definitely had better political rights, and they would pay a different tax than what the Muslims actually paid. Now, in order to get context from a religious point of view,
Okay, so just to give you an idea of how fast it is spread and how it began, we are going to go through a lot more next week. But the most important period of economic and scientific achievement of these regions under Muslim rule is the Abbasid period, the green line that you can see from 750 coming all the way to early 13th century. So do some reading or watch some videos. There's plenty of videos about it. I sent some recommendations. Get familiar with the Abbasid period of Islam for next week. And I'm going to send you the assigned readings for it. Questions, comments? Very well. See you soon.